Okay, welcome to episode 118 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Dr. Warren Larkin. Warren Larkin is a consultant clinical psychologist who, prior to founding Warren Larkin Associates in 2017, spent 24 years in the NHS working predominantly with individuals and families experiencing serious mental health difficulties. Warren is currently co-leading the implementation of trauma-informed approaches in 100 secondary schools in England, which is being evaluated by means of a randomized controlled trial funded by the Youth Endowment Fund and the Home Office. Welcome, Warren.
Thanks, Piers. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, really great to have you. I've been really enjoying listening to some of your podcasts over the last couple of weeks, and yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by today's discussion. How I'd love to begin, Warren, is to talk a little bit about your journey. How did you get into doing the work you're now doing?
Okay. Well, um, it's hard to know where to start, really. I think this is the first chapter of the book that I'm writing, actually. So I think I worked for most of my life in mental health. So I work with people, most of my career is with people with serious mental health issues. So when we say serious, I suppose we mean things like psychosis, bipolar, mood problems, personality issues. I purposely avoid the term disorder because I think it's unnecessary and unhelpful. Um, so yeah, I kind of grew up in a working class family. I was lucky that I had a supportive, loving family, and that wasn't the source of my personal trauma. But I kind of school was a difficult time. I'd say that was traumatic at times. And I kind of went to university, not by design, but more by accident. Studied psychology and then gained some experience in different aspects of mental health. So I worked in a Prestwich Hospital, which is one of the last asylums. It was one of the biggest asylums in Europe at the time. You know, when it was fully operational, I think they had 5,000 patients. Um, so I worked there. I think I was 22 when I worked there, and I worked with what they called the old long stay patients, which pretty much meant people had been there for 50 years at least. So I went to this hospital, and I was of the opinion that hospitals were places where people went to get better. You know, it was temporary, but actually, the people I was working with had been there for 50 years, sometimes more, and they were going in there for things like what today we would call panic attacks or anxiety or low mood, or even having a child out of wedlock, or even being homeless. You know, so after the Second World War, there were a lot of people who were displaced who came to England as a place of refuge and ultimately ended up homeless and were then put in the hospital, in the psychiatric hospital. So it was full of people that I think were deemed socially unacceptable at the time. So I was kind of shocked by this. And what I learned from that experience is that locking people up for a long time without a genuinely therapeutic regime is not particularly helpful, as you can tell by the fact they were still there 50 years later. Um, I mean, I learned a lot about the power of relationships as well, because at the time I wasn't trained. I was an assistant psychologist. I had a degree, but I wasn't clinical psychologist. So I learned a lot about the power of relationships during that time. And also I learned a lot about the fact that the only real thing those people had in common was that they'd experienced something traumatic. And they were being treated as if they had this mental disorder, this mental illness. And in fact, most of them were traumatized. And the treatments that they received, the drugs, the electroconvulsive therapy, etc., didn't work, did they? Because they were still there 50 years later. So that was an important part of my journey, and I guess I became interested in trauma during that period. And then I went on to become qualified as a clinical psychologist and specialize in trauma and psychosis. Primarily, my intention was to specialize in psychosis, but because pretty much everybody I ever met with psychosis and experienced trauma, it meant that the two things were what I specialized in as a result. And I did that for 24 years. And then the last 5 years of my career, I was clinical director for Children and Family Services in Lancashire. So went from being a very specialist clinician leader, leading a center of excellence, looking at first episode psychosis to then becoming responsible for like public health kind of services. So I saw, I was responsible for health visiting, for example, um, and CAMS and sexual health and children's therapies and things like that. And that was a really different perspective. So I came away from that with this understanding of how systems work and how the NHS operates and how policies are made. I was a clinical lead for the Department of Health for 2 years on adverse child experiences. So I was involved in policy development. So I think I've ended up here by accident because I left school with virtually no qualifications. And maybe we can touch on that later on. But
Mhm.
I kind of ended up with this clinical career, but also with this leadership career, which means that I kind of see that picking up the pieces, which is what I'd spent a lot of my career doing, isn't the solution actually. It's
Mhm.
part of the solution, but it's not the solution. The real solution is the early years. It's childhood. It's helping families raise their children in a way that maximizes their well-being, that preserves their health, that allows them to thrive. So I'm sat here today very much of the view that prevention is better than cure. We invest in health and well-being. We invest in prevention. We invest in the early years and families, and we see a huge return. Whereas what we're currently doing is in our system, we spend most of our time and effort and resources on picking up the pieces, and that isn't working. So yeah, so here we are. Hope that's
Mm.
hope that's
That's great. I love that analogy of, prevention is better than, you know, I think I was listening to one of your other talks talking about pulling people out of the river. That I think it's Desmond Tutu saying that it's much better. We need to stop
yeah.
pulling people out of the river and actually go upstream and ask why
Find
they're.
out where they're falling in. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, it's attributed to Desmond Tutu. Some people think it's Nelson Mandela who said that, but they did grow up in the same town apparently. So maybe they came up with it together over a beer one night. I don't know.
Maybe.
But yeah, there's a truth. There's a fundamental truth in that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard that analogy as well in other situations is like it's a bit like a tree that's basically dying and we're just spray painting the leaves green rather than looking, well, what's the problem?
Yeah,
Why are the roots dying?
absolutely. And I think that's why that analogy of moving upstream is really crucial because we can't meet demand. So in the current health and care system, we are constantly striving to meet this demand. And currently we've got, I think last time I looked at the King's Fund data, there was about 160,000 vacancies in the NHS and even more in social care. So it's something like 1 in 12 vacancies in the NHS, 1 in 12 posts is vacant, and 1 in 9 posts is vacant in social care. So they have a huge workforce deficit. And all of that is against the backdrop of increasing demand. So the workforce is going that way and the demand is going that way. And that's been happening for over a decade. So we have an urgent problem. The workforce is depleted both in terms of numbers and resilience. And if we don't do something to address that demand and look after the workforce at the same time as that, removing barriers for people affected by trauma, those three things have to happen simultaneously. So if we don't look after the workforce, that's just going to become untenable. If we don't introduce trauma-informed approaches, people are just not going to get the right help because we treat the symptoms but ignore the cause. And then ultimately, if we don't invest in prevention, we're never going to be able to meet demand. So those three things have to happen simultaneously and urgently. And I think realistically, even if we start focusing on that, even if the government's missions to address these issues, these kind of inequalities and lack of access and long-term problems, even if it's hugely successful, I think we're looking at a decade to get to a point where you can walk into A&E and in 2 hours you'll be treated and you'll be on your way. Or I can ring up my GP and go, yeah, I can see you on Tuesday. We're so far away from that. And
Mm.
where people come away, people get to the end of work on a Friday and go, oh, I'm really lucky to work here. I love this job, as opposed to wearing 20 hats and doing three people's jobs, which is kind of where we're at currently. And people lots of people in public service are looking for different jobs. They don't want to work there anymore. They're exhausted. You only got to look at teaching as a profession. I think I was talking to someone who's part of this global research consortium on education, and they were saying that I think in England they said we train something like 60,000 teachers a year, but we lose about 40,000 every year. And new teachers stay in the job on average for 5 years before they leave. So that curve is going downhill as well, which explains why teachers and staff in education are so depleted and so exhausted. And they're doing such an important job, but they're doing it in impossible circumstances. So yeah, anyway, I could talk
Mm.
about the need to move upstream all day, but
Yeah, well, I'd love maybe for us to begin with the high level. What is trauma in your understanding?
okay. So the word trauma means injury or wound, and
Mm.
it comes from the Greek. And it basically, we're talking in the context of stress. So the word trauma means injury or wound. So we're talking a kind of biopsychosocial injury or wound caused by stress. And the term stress was only really applied to humans consistently after Hans Selye wrote his book, The Stress of Life, which I think was 1956, somewhere around then.
Mm.
Um, so before that, it was an engineering term. It was about the force applied to structures at which points they would collapse or, um, you know, they would stop resisting the force and there'd be some sort of breakage or rupture. And he was an endocrinologist and he was studying stress, and he decided that he'd start to understand the way external stressors or even internal stressors affected animals and humans. And he came up with this idea of the general adaptation syndrome. So he was basically exploring and trying to understand what happens when organisms are placed under stress, when we're placed under pressure. And that stress is both external in terms of life events, but also internal in terms of what goes on in our head. Um, so I guess he's the godfather of stress research, and was actually nominated 17 times for the Nobel Prize,
Wow.
but never won it, which was really, I think it's really tragic and sad. But so yeah, so the idea of traumatization is an injury or wound caused by stress when our resources that allow us to cope and stay healthy in the face of stress are inadequate to cope with that external stressor. So I always make the analogy of a set of balancing scales. So on one side of the scales is stress, trauma, tragedy, loss, adversity, and on the other side of the scales is relationships, love, support, coping strategies, things that keep us healthy in our mind, in our body, in our spirituality, in our relationships. And if there's a good balance between these two things, we stay healthy. And
Mm.
if life throws something huge at us and it lands on this side, the scale's going to tip and we're going to have some kind of vulnerability. We'll become unwell, we'll stop coping, our relationships might suffer, our mental health might suffer, our ability to maintain relationships, perform at work might suffer. Um, so there's this imbalance. And at that point, we've got to work out how to remove some of this stress or
Mm.
to heal some of this trauma in order for scales to come back into balance, which Hans Selye talks about as homeostasis. So this place of balance. And I think there are two ways of healing from trauma or traumatic stress, injurious stress. One is to address this. So psychological therapies,
Mhm.
healing practices. There's a lot of evidence around trauma-focused CBT, CBT for psychosis, EMDR. Um, those things can contextualize, process, reduce the pain of these events, and it can tip the scales back in the right direction. People become healthy again. But the problem is lots of people can't get access to these therapies
Mm.
because they're evidence-based, they're very effective, they provide good return on investment, but they're not available, which is a huge problem. So we know what works, but people can't get to these things. Whereas if you go to your GP tomorrow, you can walk out with a prescription for antidepressants or antipsychotics or whatever. There is no pill to deal with trauma. So we need these psychological therapies, but they're not available for most people, or it takes a very long time to get them. So what most people end up doing is focusing on this side of the scales. So they've been traumatized and they look really hard and they search and they acquire and they curate activities and coping strategies and practices that build their resilience and help them cope. And eventually the body of coping strategies they've collected here puts the balance back into their lives and they recover that way. Because there's so many different ways of healing from trauma. I mean,
Mhm.
if you can access trauma focused CBT and EMDR, brilliant, do that because there's a lot of evidence. I've experienced these things from both sides, both in terms of as a therapist, but also received these things myself. So I can attest to the power of those things, on a personal and professional level, let alone, the research evidence. But also, I think we forget that these things are they're not we're not born with those resilience assets. And I think resilience is a combination of assets and adaptation. So things we do, things we practice, things we
Mhm.
engage in mentally and externally, exercise, nutrition, sleep, getting into nature, meditating, doing yoga, martial arts, exercise, movement, relationships are probably the most solid source of healing. Um, that's the evidence for supportive relationships is huge in terms of probably being the single most consistent finding in terms of the resilience research
Mhm.
and probably the best predictor of recovery from trauma as well, actually. So, trauma is about this overwhelm caused by stress, this injury caused by stress, and recovery is about re establishing that balance between the toxic levels of stress here and the ways of coping and adapting here. And that's my best explanation after 30
That's
years
that's
doing this.
brilliant. I really love that, and kind of links into my experiences of having a breakdown in my 20s and doing psychotherapy. I didn't find that really helped me because I had really complex trauma. But then doing kind of the deep work of Jungian analysis, so I was doing a lot of dream work, balancing that out with yoga, with meditation, with journaling, with painting. I found the combination of those two, and Pete Walker in his book Complex PTSD, he talks about the importance of it not just being one thing, but actually being a whole range, not just cognitive, but physical. And
Yeah,
that's my experience with my clients as well.
absolutely. Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think we've all got a unique recipe
Yeah.
for recovery and we've got to find it. And I think I always say you've got to get busy with coping.
Yeah.
So I used to, when I work with people who were, often if I work with people with PTSD, horrible traumatic symptoms or psychosis symptoms, often when those acute distressing symptoms abated, once we did the work for those to be under control, what people were left with was depression or low self-esteem. And I used to say, you can't think your way out of depression. I've tried. It doesn't work. Um, what you got to do is do your way out of it.
Mm.
So before you can do the cognitive work, you got to get busy with coping. You got to become more active. You got to activate your nervous system. You got to do things that give you a sense of achievement, a sense of pleasure, a sense of mastery, and that can be a whole range of things. You got to find them. I mean, your recipe makes you a healthy, fulfilled person is not going to be the same as mine. We might have some things in common, but our journeys are different and our preferences and we're wired up differently. So I totally believe that there is no one size fits all in terms of that recovery journey, what that looks like.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant. I'd love for us to segue a bit into ACEs.
Mhm.
And as you're saying there about the recovery, you're saying the relationship is the most solid form of healing for, to recover from trauma. And I'm just obviously a lot of my conversations with people about boarding school, and if that was one thing that was missing the most from boarding school for me is that I was on my own. We didn't have relationships. It was all about it's like we're on our own. Parents have gone. You're in this dangerous place. So I'd love for us to go into you talking a bit about ACEs. What are they and how do
Yeah.
they impact us both as children and as adults?
Yeah. So the concept of adverse childhood experiences or ACEs was really created around 1998. So obviously we've known about childhood trauma for centuries, in terms of the impact on later life. But the real light was shone on it when Vincent Fleet and Robert Ander did their seminal study in 1998, or published it in 1998, looking at the impact of 10 categories of adverse child experiences on health outcomes. So they surveyed 17,000 people in San Diego in California. I think they got about 9,500 responses. They filled in a questionnaire with 10 categories of adversity. And those experiences were physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, living in a home. So they called it household dysfunction. So living in a home where someone abused drugs, where someone abused alcohol, where there was domestic violence or abuse, where there was a parent or carer who went away to prison or youth offending institution, where there was a carer or parent who had a serious mental health problem, where there was parental loss through death, divorce, or abandonment, and where there was neglect, emotional or physical neglect. So they're the 10 things that they studied. And what they found was pretty shocking, actually. They found something that I think society didn't want to hear about, and the public health community didn't want to hear about it, because they talked a lot about when they tried to get onto conference agendas to present their research. They got a very frosty reception, and for 25 years after that, nobody was interested. It didn't. It wasn't. It's only just finding its way into policy and practice, this research. So for a long time, this was nobody wanted to know that these forms of childhood trauma, these developmental traumas, are incredibly common. Um, and since that original study, 1998, there have been about 40, maybe approaching 50 population-based studies now that have kind of, in different parts of the world, and they've all found the same pattern. And that pattern is a dose-response relationship. So this dose-response means the pattern they found was the bigger the exposure or the bigger the dose of childhood trauma people are exposed to in all of these studies. Every study that's looked for this has found it. The greater the impact on people's health outcomes. So if people had high rates of adversity, they tended to have, at a population level, worse physical health, worse mental health, worse social outcomes, pretty much everything you could measure. So this relationship between dose of adversity and poor outcomes holds true for things like poorer outcomes in education. More ACEs equal poorer physical health, more cancer, more heart disease, more inflammatory conditions, more type 2 diabetes, more mental health problems, more involvement with criminal justice system, higher chances of addiction, higher chances of suicide, higher rates of depression, psychosis, personality problems, bipolar, OCD, anxiety, depression. Pretty much everything you can measure in what Americans will call human services or human, where we help people who need help.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much everything you can measure is negatively associated with childhood adversity. But I have to say, there's a really important caveat. If people have got resilience assets,
Yeah.
they tend to be protected. So, for example, if someone's exposed to a lot of child adversity, but they've also had loving adults who've cared for them at the same time, so they're going through this stuff at home, but maybe they've had a sports coach or a youth leader or a spiritual leader or a family member, or they felt a sense of belonging at high school and had teachers that cared about them and supportive peers, and they've been a part of a community. Those things are protective.
Mm-hmm.
But the research also says that people who tend to experience the most adversity also tend to have the least resilience assets. That pattern is observed. So what we don't want people to do, Piers, is go away from this and think, oh my God, I've got 5 of them. I'm doomed, to have poor health and etc. It doesn't work like that because of the scales. You might have had a lot here. You might have had slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, but you might have also had lots of things that have offset it. And you can come through that really well. And some people grow, develop strength from their post-traumatic experience. Post-traumatic growth is a concept that people need to understand as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the pattern generally is the bigger the dose of adversity, the worse the outcome. And that pattern has been stable for 25 years across 40 to 50 population-based studies in different parts of the world with different populations. It's pretty solid. So the good news is, because it's so predictable, we can technically we can get upstream and prevent it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's evidence that if we can prevent childhood adversity for the next generation, we could see, and this is analysis and projections by Public Health Wales, 50% less people going to prison, 50% less people being the victim or perpetrator of violence, 60% less people using crack and heroin and going to prison. These kinds of statistics are the projections of what would happen if we prevented childhood adversity for the next generation. So
Mm.
it's a huge opportunity, even though it's a sad story. It's very predictable, it's very stable, therefore we can tackle it. We know what works. But the problem is many of those preventative interventions and early intervention approaches, they're the first things to go when public finances are challenged.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, you're really interesting. I think I was listening to you speak about, you know, when we have someone come in to the doctor's office to ask them about their adverse childhood experiences immediately. And I mean, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned about the figures. I'd love you to share some of the costs associated with ACEs.
Wow. Well, okay. So there's a number of studies looking at the health economic costs. There's a European study by Karen Hughes and Mark Bellis, which people can look up, um, which looks at the costs in Europe for child adversity and the consequences of child adversity. But closer to home, there was a recent study in 2020 by Karen Hughes, Mark Bellis, and colleagues, where they looked at the health economic cost of child adversity in England and Wales. So in England and Wales, they calculated that the cost of healthcare as a result of adverse child experiences is £42.8 billion every year. And this is due to the cost of mental health problems, type 2 diabetes, respiratory illness, chronic multiple conditions such as um, inflammatory conditions, addiction, type 2 diabetes, respiratory illness, chronic pain. Ultimately, these things, we know there's a very strong association between childhood adversity and these conditions. So when they calculate the cost of exposure to child adversity and the consequent conditions, annual cost has been attributed as £42.8 billion, which kind of says to me, we can't keep picking up the pieces and treating the symptoms but ignoring the cause, which is what we do. We've got to move upstream and tackle the cause of the problem, which is people's toxic levels of stress or childhood adversity or childhood trauma, whatever we want to call it. But I like this term toxic stress because it kind of tells us that stress can become harmful.
Mm.
Stress is actually healthy at one end. We need it to
Mm.
develop and grow, and for children to become mature in terms of their mind and their body and their physiology. It becomes tolerable when it's in moderate doses, offset by resilience assets. But then it can become toxic if it's severe, harmful, injurious, and it's not offset by enough resilience and coping assets. So I think that's the problem, is that we're dealing with adverse child experiences, which means that people are ultimately dealing with toxic levels of stress. And that's affecting their physical health, their emotional health, their relationships, their ability to hold down a job, the likelihood of getting involved in criminal justice settings, addictions. You know, ultimately, we know enough now to say, okay, if we were gonna if we were gonna tackle this problem and transform this situation, we would agree that this would probably take 10, 20 years. But within that 2 decades, we could see a transformation in population health if
Mm.
we only commit long term to preventative and early intervention strategies.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Carry on.
No, I just remembered this study,
Mm. Mm.
denial, disbelief, and delays. I meant to mention it. So this is a study by University of Suffolk and a charity called Survivors in Transition. Um, they wanted to understand the experience of sexual abuse survivors. And they've done a series of studies. I recommend looking up their website because they do some brilliant work. Um, I contributed some case material for this study, and the idea was to examine the cost on the NHS of delayed child sexual abuse disclosures, because we know that if we don't ask people directly, they tend not to tell. And for some people, that can take a lifetime. So part of my work is about training professionals to ask about adversity routinely. Like we ask about suicide now, like we ask about what people drink, what people smoke. You know, we ask all kinds of sensitive questions. But when people come and seek help, for some reason, we don't ask them about their past trauma. Instead, we treat their current depression, or we treat their current alcohol problem, or we treat their current chronic pain. What we don't do is ask them what happened to them. So this study looked at 608 sexual abuse survivors in England and Wales, and it was fascinating. I mean, we worked with a health economist, and I presented some of my case material from clients that I've worked with, anonymized, of course, from the past. And we just mapped out their journeys and we looked at some of these indicative costs. And basically, what we found was that, first of all, the amount of time it takes for someone in our current system to disclose abuse, to be heard. From the point of the abuse starting to the point of disclosure was 27 and a half years on average.
Wow.
And during that period of time, people are bouncing around the health and care system, getting all kinds of help that is ineffective. And in some cases, is harmful. Because if you're being treated for psychosis, when in actual fact, the reason you're paranoid is because people have hurt you a lot in your life, but you're being treated as if you're having this mental illness called psychosis, you're being given antipsychotic drugs, which some of them are quite toxic and can have a detrimental effect on your broader health. And if you're unlucky, you can end up with a condition called metabolic syndrome. And you can gain lots of weight and you can develop type 2 diabetes, and it can affect your sexual health. It can affect your metabolic and endocrine health. Ultimately, it can shorten your life. So often people are getting help that's not working, but they're getting more and more different kinds of medications and different kinds of treatment approaches, but it's not resolving the problem. And what they found in this study was for those 608 people, the average lifetime health cost per survivor was £4.9 million. And the collective cost for that group of people was £3 billion. So if we continue, and this one client here, Bree, if you download this document, you'll see her journey through the health system. This is a client I work with. Her health costs, because her childhood trauma wasn't addressed, was £9.2 million. So this is really stark reading, but it tells us that ultimately, if we don't start acknowledging that many of the problems dealing in the health and mental health system are driven by the consequences of childhood trauma, and we don't start asking people what happened to them and then giving them the right help, we're just never going to be able to solve the problem.
Mm,
We're never going to be able to get to the bottom of it because
mm,
we repeatedly apply the wrong approach. We repeatedly treat a problem as a medical condition or a psychiatric condition when in fact it's a process of trying to recover from something bad that happened to you.
mm,
So
mm,
until we recognize that, things are not going to improve. We're just going to keep throwing good money after bad, and
mm,
people are not getting the right help. So one of the things I think we absolutely have to get better at doing is routinely asking people sensitively and skillfully about their childhood trauma
mm.
in the context of them seeking help.
Yeah, thank you. So 4.9 was the average of these 608 people. What is the overall population average in the UK for how much each person has to, is spent on them uh, in the healthcare system? Say, for example.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. What we do know is in England and Wales, half the population have been exposed to at least one childhood adversity,
Mm,
and 1 in 10 people say they've had four or more. And the more you're exposed to child adversity, the greater the risk of all of those health conditions, of all of those mental health problems, and of all of those risks like being involved in criminal justice, being involved in violence, being involved in, getting addicted to drugs. So we know that the higher the rate of adversity, the greater the cost to the system, because the greater the likelihood that you're going to experience all of those subsequent problems. So I don't have the average health costs in the UK, but we do know that the costs associated with adversity are disproportionate compared
mm,
to the general population.
mm. Wow, wow, really interesting. I mean, one of the things I would love for us to touch on a little bit, and maybe this is more of a question, is before we began, I just mentioned about the ACEs and
Mm,
it being to do with household. What would it take for us to do an ACEs or create a test, but for people in care or people in boarding schools?
yeah. Well, there's a lot of debate about the 10 ACEs, the 10 categories of adversity, and they're the things we know the most about. They've been the most studied. But we also know that that list is not exhaustive. So there's two things. One, the ACEs questionnaire was context specific. It was kind of really asking about home life.
Mm.
So therefore, it might not quite read across to somebody who's living in a children's home or somebody who's in a boarding school. Um, so I think there's a case there for adaptation. There's a case for adapting questionnaires. So they've already adapted questionnaires for. There's a teen version of the ACE questionnaire. There's a carer version. So rather than asking a small child directly, which would probably be inappropriate, we ask the carer about their experience. Um, there are different versions of the questionnaire. We developed a questionnaire version that includes child sexual exploitation, which is not in the standard questionnaire. So I think to develop a version that reads appropriately for someone in boarding school would be reasonable. For someone who's living in a care setting, again, reasonable. You could adapt it to that context. I think the only risk is if we make the questionnaire this endless list of things, because ultimately what we're trying to do is the list of 10 ACEs is not exhaustive. So when I talk to somebody about adverse child experiences and use a questionnaire or use the cards that are behind me, those cards have got about 30 different kinds of adversities in the deck. So we know there are many more kinds of adversity. But if we have a questionnaire that is 20 pages long with everything that we know has a negative impact on people's health, they're never going to get through it and they won't want to fill it in. So instead, we often use this list of 10 as a starting point. So people, because we know they're quite common, people will complete the questionnaire and that's a starting conversation. But there's always a question at the end when I do this, and the way we teach professionals to do it, which says, is there anything else that's happened to you that might have been difficult, stressful, traumatic, adverse, out of the ordinary, painful, that's not on this list? So it's not, we shouldn't see this as the be all and end all.
Mm.
This for me, the ACE questionnaire for me is a prop. It's a way of having a conversation, but it's not the entirety of the conversation.
Mm. Yeah, 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 fascinating. Yeah, yeah, I'd love to do that at some point is create with someone a question, 10 questions for boarding school. Because one of my hobbies, fascinations is I buy biographies of
Mm.
people who've been to boarding school. I
Yeah.
have about 45 now, and I bought Freddie Mercury's book
Ah, okay.
last a couple of days ago, reading through it. And he was sent from Zanzibar to India as an age 8 through till 16. He went home once a year, and he makes a reference to the food. He says it's the world's worst food, and they said if we didn't eat it, we would have starved.
Yeah.
And he says, they said in the biography, he struggled with food the rest of his life.
Oh,
And I'm, for me, that ticks the neglect box.
yeah.
David Cameron, again, he's saying he's lost a stone in weight, age 7 or 8,
Wow.
which is a quarter to a third of his body weight. And when I read the stories, if I look at the aces question, I think, well, I'm not sure if that would be a tick, but oh yeah, they were being beaten by the teachers or by the other pupils. And
Yeah.
it's almost like what we've done, as someone said in a call I did a couple of weeks ago, saying boarding schools haven't been normalized, they've been idealized. And
Yes.
therefore, oh, it was good for me. And we won't share these stories.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it would make sense to look at a context specific version. It would make sense, wouldn't it, given what you've said? And I remember we spoke the other week about how interesting it is that lots of people in public life who've been to boarding school end up in a couple of areas. They seem to end up as senior leaders or politicians
Mm.
with this kind of extreme personality type that allows you to function well in that environment, or in the special forces. It's
Yeah.
like there's two kind of destinations that seem to be pretty common for people who've been through that experience.
Mm. Yeah.
extremely high performers in the world of business or politics, or extremely high performers in the world of military, and you can see how actually, if you're going to create some sort of training regime for someone to function in those extreme roles, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Take away from your family, learn to be self-sufficient, learn to shut off your emotions, learn to put up with physical and psychological abuse, neglect, harsh conditions sometimes. Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I'd never thought of it until you raised it actually, but yeah,
Yeah, I just find it fascinating. It's like, yeah, what is the impact? I've started a
yeah,
database with I've got about 240, 250 names of some of the most powerful people in the world. Donald Trump, Christopher Wray, who's just resigned as FBI director.
okay,
He's boarding school. Elon Musk was at a boarding school, although he didn't board. Rupert Murdoch. They've all been to boarding school.
yeah,
When you look at it and you're like,
mm,
that's an interesting question. And especially when you give the statistics that of the aces that, well, if you've got two, three, four aces, and if we were to do a questionnaire which said, okay, you might not have got physical violence from dad, but you certainly got it from the teacher. There you
yeah,
go, that's one. Then the neglect one's two.
yeah,
Then you're looking at three or four for most of these global leaders.
mm,
And it's like, well, okay.
yeah.
So,
And how do you cope? How do people cope with unresolved childhood trauma? How do they cope with that emotional wound that they've got? Sometimes the ways that we cope are unhelpful and harmful. Sometimes we rely on drugs or alcohol or
mm,
sex or gambling or whatever it is. Sometimes we overcompensate.
mm,
We don't feel good enough. We don't feel we deserve. We feel shame. We feel embarrassment. So we try and work our way out of it. We try and achieve our way out of it to
mm,
become this ideal, to become this acceptable figure. But it's never enough, is it? It's never enough. We never satisfy our sense of not being quite good enough. And I think I always often talk about my own imposter syndrome. And no matter what I achieve, I always feel like an imposter. I always feel like I maybe I'm a bit of a fraud and I shouldn't be here doing what I'm doing.
mm,
Um, and I think unaddressed, that imposter syndrome pushes you further and further and further. And it's never enough. So you just have to keep going. And I mean, you just think, well, why would someone like Joe Biden or Donald Trump want to be president at that age? At that point in their life,
mm,
what drives them to want this incredibly difficult and stressful job at that point in their life? After all they've achieved, what makes them want to do it?
mm.
Yeah, it fascinates me.
Mm. Well, it's interesting. Channel 4 put out a documentary last year, maybe it was earlier this year, about Boris Johnson. And they said
Oh, it
when
has.
he got into the Downing Street,
Yeah.
it was like, oh, job done. You're like, what? Because
Tick.
that was it.
Yeah.
Tick. I don't have to do anything now.
Yes.
And if you read in Sonia Purnell's book about Boris,
Oh,
I
okay.
mean, she says in here that the people in his family realized that he had put on this persona because he was being bullied at this boarding school age 11. The persona of the bumbling English eccentric, that was a survival
Yeah.
tactic.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And you're like, oh,
I think that's partly what causes some of us to overcompensate is that we've got to survive, right? You've got to create an identity that's acceptable in that context. I also think that's what drives toxic masculinity as well. I think in some settings, it's not okay to be sensitive. It's not okay to be thoughtful, um, artistic, expressive. In some settings, you've got to be tough. You've got to be resilient. You've got to be manly, whatever that means. You've got to be aggressive to fit in, because it's dog eat dog, So I can see why, some people end up being these almost kind of like larger than life characters, these kind of extreme versions of a personality, because it's what they've had to do to survive.
mhm,
But there's no kind of pause where there's a recognition of, do you know what? maybe I'm okay as I am. Maybe I've achieved all I need to achieve. Maybe I'm acceptable just the way things are. I don't have
Mhm.
to drive and strive for the next thing, even though it might not be good for me or all the people around me. But
Mhm.
something inside says to be acceptable, you've got to keep going. And the only way you can stop feeling this stuff is by keeping going in that direction.
Mhm.
Is anything else
Mhm.
unacceptable?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It was there's a study someone said that after prime ministers finish in office, they get these speaking jobs.
Yeah.
And someone did some research and they found out that most of the prime ministers who've been to private school, they keep the money themselves. Gordon Brown is one of the onlys who went to a comprehensive. He
Oh,
gives his money to charity. And I
right.
just thought, it's that almost that wound, I'm not good enough. Therefore, I have to amass as much money as possible
Yeah,
for
yeah, yeah,
me
yeah.
to prove. Whereas someone who has that, what you said, the resilience, they know they're good enough and they can.
I think with social rank, I think that's for me, that's about social rank. And social rank in our society means power.
Mm,
So it's a form of esteem, isn't it? I compare myself to all the other people in my life and around me, and I'm superior, I'm more powerful, my social rank is greater, and therefore that makes me better and acceptable. It's so interesting, and there's a real link there with mental health as well. We find with when people have command hallucinations, they hear voices telling them to do things. Often, when people's self-esteem improves, if we work on someone's self-esteem, the power of the voice reduces. And this is called social rank theory. When people feel less powerful, less equivalent to their peers or people around them, the voice is more powerful.
mhm,
So when the self-esteem gets better, the power of the voice reduces. Maybe there's something going on with people who strive for power. Maybe it really is about self-esteem, self-worth, self-acceptance. And maybe that's the solution.
mm. Yeah, great. I mean, we've got about 10, 15 minutes left, and I have a few questions. There was a few things
Mm,
that we talked about a couple of weeks ago.
yeah,
One was just around this 100 school study, and also routine inquiry
yeah,
about adversity. I'd love you to maybe touch on those a bit, please.
yeah. So maybe I'll go with routine inquiry first. Ultimately, what we know is if you don't ask people directly what's happened to them in a very clear and explicit way, they tend not to tell. I mean, the study I just showed you says
Mm,
27 and a half years was the point between someone began experiencing abuse and the point they were able to tell and be heard by a professional. Um, when I started in the NHS nearly 30 years ago, we didn't talk directly to people about suicide. We didn't talk directly to people about delusional beliefs. And there was a fear that if you talk to people about those things, you just kind of encourage those ideas. Today, we know the exact opposite is true. Actually, you need to be open and honest and explicit about suicidal thoughts. So, for years, I would start my therapy sessions by saying, okay, so let's agree our agenda for today. Right at the beginning, I always check in with you, see how you're doing. One of the things I always ask you to do is to fill in this short questionnaire about your mood. And you know that every week I'm going to ask you about whether you're having suicidal thoughts and whether you're feeling hopeless. And that's just standard. Is that okay? Yeah, that's all right. So every single week, I would ask people about whether they were hopeless, whether they were suicidal, and that was a normal part of my approach. And then as I started to understand trauma more, a normal part of my approach would be, look, I'm always going to ask you about your mood, whether you're feeling hopeless and suicidal, but I'm also going to ask you as part of our assessment about your experiences of growing up. And we ask everybody that we see about their experiences of adversity in childhood or trauma in childhood. So we really know that bad things that happen to children growing up can have an impact on their physical health, their mental health, and their emotional well-being generally, including relationships and how we parent. So that's why we ask everybody about these things. Some of them might apply to you, some of them might not, and it's not essential. But if you think it's okay for me to ask you these questions, I'd be really grateful because it's often really helpful to understand. How does that sound? And then obviously we talk about confidentiality, but that became a standard part of my assessment process. And what I realized when I started doing that was everybody that I asked those questions had childhood adversity.
Mhm.
Everybody. And if people said no, I've not experienced those things, generally what would happen is over the course of them getting to know and trust me, they would eventually disclose some of those things. So it became obvious from my clinical practice that if we don't ask people, they don't tell. If we do ask people, they do tell. And there's a brilliant study by John Reed and his colleague. I can't remember his colleague's name. I apologise. But in 1998, um, where they looked at admissions to an inpatient unit in Auckland, New Zealand, and they observed 100 admissions, standard practice. And standard practice led to 8% of people voluntarily disclosing that had experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse at some point. They then included explicit questions about this, and they asked people directly. And for the next 100 admissions, they used this explicit direct approach where they asked people. And in that case, 82% of people disclosed physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. So it's really clear. There are lots of studies that show us this, but if we don't ask, people don't tell. So I've spent the last 20 years in various forms training professionals to ask, to understand why it's important, to know how to ask, how to introduce the conversation, how to make the inquiry, how to respond sensitively and therapeutically to that disclosure, and then how to tie up that conversation in a safe way. We developed a model called REACH, which stands for Routine Inquiry about Adversity in Childhood. And this is a model of training and support that we've been delivering in lots of different contexts for many years. So we've done this with GPs. We've got, academic evaluations of that intervention in GPs, and we've proven that it's feasible and acceptable, both to professionals and patients. We also find that if you ask people, they tend to tell you, and then you find out that the people with the more adversity have got the most health conditions. So you also find out that the vast majority of people who are asked about their adversity have never been asked before, and they've never linked their current problems to their past trauma. So they're,
Mhm.
they're seeking a medical solution for their mood problems or their psychiatric problems or their pain or their addiction. And when you ask them about their past experience and they join the dots, they start to see that actually the pain that I'm in, physical, mental, or social pain, the distress, is linked to what happened to them. It's not separate. It's not this inflammatory condition or this chronic pain is not a mysterious physical illness. My problem in relationships, my anger problems, my mental health issues, they're not a mystery because by funny genes, or a brain chemistry that's decided to become out of kilter. There's a really obvious link to what's happened. So when
Mhm.
you ask those questions, people start to go, "Oh my God, I never thought about it before." But you know what? I started to feel that way when this happened, and I started to cope in this way when this happened, and I kind of lost track of that. But actually, it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. And the number of times I've spoken to people with a diagnosis of psychosis, and I've asked them what happened to them, and suddenly they're going, "Well, given that I was hurt a lot by my stepdad, that I was abused physically, it kind of makes sense that I'm scared of people hurting me in adult life. So it kind of makes sense that I'm hyper vigilant to threat. It kind of
Mhm.
makes sense that I can't trust people, that I think people want to hurt me. So does that mean that I'm not paranoid? Does that mean that my paranoia that is meant to be part of this illness called psychosis, does that mean that I'm not mad?" And I go, "Well, I never thought you were, but you've just recognized that your fear of other people is due to what happened to you, not
Mhm.
because you've got too much dopamine."
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
instantly, that person's gone from thinking, "I'm mad and I've got this illness called schizophrenia in the worst cases." It's called that, which is not a great word. But ultimately, that person goes, "Oh, do you know what? Maybe I'm not mad. Maybe it makes perfect sense, actually. Maybe it makes
Mhm.
perfect sense that I'm scared of people because of what I've been through." So suddenly that person starts to be more compassionate towards himself and starts to see the fact that, you know what, my recovery is not about taking psychiatric medication necessarily. I'm not saying it isn't helpful for some people, but maybe my recovery is about addressing this stuff that's happened to me and
Mhm.
feeling differently about myself and feeling differently about other people in the world that I live in. Maybe that's a solution. So for me, the whole business of asking people what happened to them is can be transformational.
That routine inquiry, I think I could link that directly to boarding school. So many
Yeah,
people, one, they think it's, like I said, it's seen as a good thing, but often it's the wives who come to me and say, I think it's because of my husband's or my wife's boarding school time. They can't see it because they've
yeah,
been told it's good. But they
absolutely.
have exactly the same symptoms.
Yeah,
Most of the people who come to me, stomach aches or
yeah,
stomach problems, IBS, things like that, struggle in relationships, alcoholism, insomnia, they have the same things, but they don't link it to what happened to them as a child.
absolutely. And as soon as you make the links,
Mm,
your strategies for coping and your thoughts about what is going to help you feel better, they change.
mm,
So
mm,
you might be pursuing a medical route thinking, well, I've got this physical condition called chronic inflammation. The solution is the latest drug. You know, actually, they start to look back and go, do you know what? It's all starting to make sense. Actually, what I need to do is learn to regulate my nervous system. I need to heal some of this pain from the past. I need to forgive myself. I need to generate compassion. I need to forgive myself. I need to stop blaming myself for what happened because it wasn't my fault. And one of the things about routine inquiry is when you ask someone and they tell you what's happened to them, you can say to people, "Do you know what? That happened to you.
mm,
That wasn't. That didn't happen because of you. You didn't make it happen. It wasn't your fault." And that shame and embarrassment, that guilt that maybe I should have done something different, maybe I could have stopped it from happening. That unburdening, letting go of that self-blame is a huge part of the recovery journey. And that's why it's one of the targets in cognitive therapy. One of the things we focus on a lot is self-blame.
mm,
Because if you're blaming yourself for something that happened back then, how are you ever going to feel okay about your life and about yourself and about your relationships? Are you ever going to be to show love to yourself?
mm,
So that's why I think it's fundamentally important. It's part of the solution.
mm, 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 mm. We could talk for hours, Warren, and I'm aware that we both have meetings in a bit. Um, so how do people find out more about your work, your papers? I mean, you've got your website, Warren Larkin Associates. Is there any other way?
Well, I'm kind of active on Twitter, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. We've got company pages on those things. Um, I'm always happy to talk to people if they want to discuss anything. So yeah, people can just go to my website and arrange a call or go to email my secretary, Lisa, Lisa at warrenlarkinassociates.co.uk. Always happy to talk. And yeah, I can, on my website, there are some talks that have been recorded. I did a talk recently on the trauma informed schools work, where we started off with 100 schools in this trial. Now we've got about 60, I think, 65 maybe. Um, that's a whole other subject. Maybe we can come back to it another time. But the,
Definitely.
the good news is we're looking at the government are funding research into trauma informed practice. And one of the areas we think can make a huge impact is in schools because children are developing brains and bodies. They are often exposed to childhood trauma, and school's meant to be a safe place where they've got access to safe adults and appropriate help where they can be protected and nurtured and grow and develop. And we know the best predictor of adult life success and satisfaction over the life course is the child's emotional health while they're at school, with the worst predictor being their educational attainment. So it's really important because the current focus for many years has been their exam passing machines. And actually, what we know is passing exams is not the best predictor of outcome later on in life. Your emotional health while you're at school is the best predictor of your life success and satisfaction. And that is something we really need to get right. So it's this balance again, it's getting that emphasis right. So schools are assessed on their ability to nurture and care for and help develop children's emotional health and social health. That should be something they're assessed on just the same as the exam results. And if schools are assessed that way, then that mean resources were focused on both of those things. That's why I
That's
think this trial is super important, not to mention traumatized children having much more, the odds are stacked against them in terms of the current school system. So
mm, mm,
this is, we're really excited about the trial in terms of what we're going to learn from it. and what can help us take forward in that really important
Mm.
context of education.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Yeah, it would be great to have you back on. And I mean, I could go down a rabbit hole there about emotional health and social health, but I will start drawing this to an end. But thank you. What amazing work you're doing, and really bless you for coming and speaking today. And
Thank you
I
so much for
feel
that.
very inspired. So thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, take care.